in Black environmental history and politics, and why I actually teach it. So with that being said, I'm gonna just pull up the PowerPoint to kind of direct my discussion. I can talk a lot, but I do want this very much to be a dialogue. So I'm going to try my best to limit my comments just to give context to what I'm trying to share, and then towards the middle and end, if people want, we should just have essentially a conversation. And at any time throughout the presentation, if people have questions, it'll be a little difficult for me, however, to monitor the chat questions in the Zoom environment. So I'll do my best at that. I'm not sure, Siddiqui, will you be doing that?
You. Yeah, I got you. I can take care of that.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's up to you too. So, if you're comfortable, if you want to do a Q&A at the end, my apologies. If you want to do a Q&A at the end, if that's easier, or usually people will put questions in there, but I'll be on the lookout for it. And if there's room to ask in the middle of your presentation, I'll ask. But if not, we'll hold those questions in the comments till the end.
Okay. So I don't know can everybody see the presentation? Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That's cool. That's cool. All right. So essentially, my conversation is about teaching Black environmental history and politics. It's like a perspective, a perspective about why, a perspective about how I came to be interested in this area of research. Also a perspective about how, right? Some approaches, some ways of thinking about teaching Black environmental history and politics and why it's important. And then the last thing I want to kind of cover is what we actually do in the course itself. And I've been teaching this course probably since around, I want to say 2014, off and on in our department. And it's actually taught in lieu of a comparative politics course, which is a mandatory course in our political science division. So in short, teaching Black environmental history and politics, a perspective. So first, what inspired me? So I'm a child of the late 90s. Well, no, that's not true. the early 90s. There was a lot going on during the period. You had the anti-apartheid movement. You had the rise of Spike Lee as an independent artist and his impact politically on the country. You had the Rodney King rebellions. You had what many like to call the golden age of hip hop. And I'm actually from Philadelphia, PA, eventually. So things going on in the world at that time had a great impact on me. And I'm showing, these pictures are like prompts for me. This, if you can see my cursor, these are my parents, and they were activists in Philadelphia for a very long time. And that influenced me. And actually, when I went to college initially, and probably for most of my life, I wanted to be a veterinarian since I was about 6 or so. But I was very immersed in nature, in the outdoors, in the environment. And that was very much influenced by my mother. But then when I went to college, I like to say sometimes I got a little sidetracked in the quote unquote movement, if you will. And I wasn't mature enough to blend my ideas or my passion really around the environment and what I saw socially and politically during that time. So I kind of segued my way into African American studies and political science because those were the things that I was reading at the time. And that was an important shift. But later in my graduate work, in my personal life, came back around to that and I became an organic farmer, right? I have a local farm in Tallahassee on Bradfordville Road called Futu Organics. So very much what inspired me as much to teach Black environmental history was not just what I was learning and what I was learning and what I was experiencing and what I was studying in an academic context, but it was also very much influenced by my life and my development as a young person, my parents, the kind of environment that I grew up in, as well as the historical period that I developed. And I'm a graduate of HBCUs, so this is, part of my evolution. I went to, how do people say the Florida A&M University? I went to the Tuskegee University, right? Some people say Booker T School, and we're probably very familiar with that. And when we talk about sustainability, people should definitely remember the contributions and legacy of George Washington Carver. And it was at Tuskegee University that I fell in love with the South, and I never kind of returned home. So I've been in the southern U.S. For more than half my life now. And that was very purposeful that my parents sent me to Tuskegee University. And then from there, I went and did graduate work. And this is important in terms of my approach to teaching Black environmental history and politics. I went to Clark Atlanta University. And many of you may be familiar with this person here, W.B. Du Bois, who was a sociologist who ended up teaching at Atlanta University, and I believe started the sociology department, as well as social work department, if I remember correctly. But he was there for a very long time until he left to work on the Crisis magazine and lead the NAACP. And he very much influenced this person in the middle. This was my mentor. His name is Mac Henry Jones. And he's an important figure in African-American studies, political science in particular, because he led the walkout of the American Political Science Association, and he created or helped to co-create what's called the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. And his basic idea was that we need to construct a discipline as well as professional organizations committed, I'm sorry, and connected to communities that does social science in the interest of Black people. And that's the way he taught. So the PhD program that I came out of philosophically in his curriculum was grounded in what he would describe as the Black experience and the experiences of communities in the global South. That was very intentional. And this idea was informed by an article that he used to always hand out by W.B. Du Bois called The Field and Function of the Negro College. And he wrote this article. It was actually a speech in 1933 he gave to Fisk University after reflecting about his time in HBCUs at Atlanta University, in particular, going to Fisk, having gone to Harvard, and being called upon to, for lack of a better term, to talk about the state of Black people, the state of Black education, the state of HBCUs. And what he basically outlined from his perspective is that any HBCU, regardless of where it was in the country, should ground its curriculum, its mission, its goals and objectives in the history, the culture, and the contemporary social, economic, and political problems of Black people. And that wasn't to say that there's not a notion of universal knowledge, right? In a sense, or the idea that you can't learn from other ethnic groups, other historical experiences, other cultures and societies. But he made the argument that you have to start on the ground where you are and begin from that space and move outward. So he made this argument that curriculum should be developed around the population of students that are in the school itself. And that was the only way that you were going to develop an educated community that was both inspired and prepared intellectually and practically as well to live, to develop, to expand their own understanding of society, but their communities at the same time, right? So this very much informed how W.B. Du Bois taught, and by extension, Dr. Jones on the bottom. And he inculcated in his students to do that same thing. So although he graduated from the University of Illinois in the 50s and 60s, he always made a commitment to teaching at historically Black colleges and universities. He taught at Clark Atlanta University. That's where he began. Taught at Howard and Prairie View, and he would come back to Clark Atlanta and retire. So hence why I'm at FAMU and many of my colleagues as well around the country at different HBCUs. So that's one thing. You know, my educational training influences how I teach a particular approach to teaching the social sciences and STEM fields through what you could describe as a Black lens or African-centered lens, right? But then we have the contemporary historical context. So we're on Zoom for a reason, right? We're in the midst of a COVID crisis. We're in the midst of what many kind of predict as a potential recession, God forbid, a long-term recession or depression of some sort. And then all around the country, we have this socioeconomic conflict around social inequality, economic inequality, racial inequality. And then this is not unique to the US. You know, was buzzing in the news now is what's happening in Nigeria as we speak, right? So we have all these issues: police violence, health disparities, economic inequality, political disenfranchisement, you know, the crazy debate that was yesterday, failed states in the Caribbean and Africa. You know, there's multiple problems, but at the same time, we see these environmental problems, right? And I'll list a few: e-waste and deforestation in Africa. If any of you remember Hurricane Katrina and the crisis in New Orleans, the Flint water crisis, the Gulf oil spill, all these things that exist essentially parallel to one another, but we don't look at them intentionally in that way, right? So one of the approaches that we take in the class or approaching the teaching of Black environmental history is that social and economic inequality and environmental degradation are essentially two sides of the same coin. And it's important as such to approach the issue in that way. And here's a quote from a text called Just Sustainabilities by Julian Ajaman that essentially makes that argument. So this is one of the things students are introduced to or should be introduced to from my perspective, not just in the context of the class, but in the context of STEM fields in the general sense, particularly in classes that study the environment. So I wanted to know why people don't often intentionally make the connection. And what is that to say? Despite we look at things like industrialization, species extinction, global warming, and urbanization, and then we look at the conditions of Black folk in the context of the Caribbean, in the context of Africa and the Pacific Islands, because the class itself studies the African diaspora. It doesn't just focus on Black people in the US. Why don't we connect these two things in the way that Dr. Ajaman says they should be connected? What are we misinterpreting in the context of the absence of using paradigms that wed knowledge or issues around socioeconomic justice with an environmental consciousness, right? And these are two people that often did that. You see Wangari Maathai at the top from Kenya, the Green Belt movement, and I'm sure you're all familiar with Robert Bullard, right? So one thing is, we think the why is because there's like a crisis of perspective, that we have to understand this thing what anthropologists call culture, and we have to rethink how we look at it. And this is a definition I give students, right? And we have many different definitions for culture. But for the course, this one is particularly useful. And I'll just summarize it. You know, all cultures are essentially, you know, the total way that people in a given society both think and act, their kind of practice. and the dynamic interaction that exists between a group's worldview and the social relationships and institutions they create to support that worldview. And institutions are essentially ways that people construct legal codes, buildings, values, ethics to ensure that a given way of behaving, of being passes down from one generation to the next. How do you prevent it from collapsing because of internal conflict or external forces? How do you teach the values, the ethics, and the processes associated with the given set of social relationships that you're talking about? That's what I'm calling institutionalization, right? So cultures evolve out of this dynamic interaction between the worldview and the social relationships and institutions created to essentially support it. But all cultures, no matter what, address essentially two fundamental issues. One is how we should relate to each other as human beings, and one is how we perceive or understand the natural environment, non-human life forms. And it's the second thing, especially in modern industrial societies, that is not as intentional, that is not as apparent until we have phenomenon like climate disruption, right? And now it's on people's radar. But as long as human beings have been on the planet, all cultures address these two fundamental areas. And then folk begin to organize in different ways. So all I'm pointing to at the bottom, what I call sub areas of culture, and you could come up with your own, like creative production is the arts, how we organize socially, our families, peer groups, religious and spiritual institutions, science and technology, economic organization, political organization, our ethics, how we understand and see history. All of this is a part of culture. There is no such thing, for instance, which we often discuss in the class, and I'll touch a little bit on later, as objective science, right? Some of the methods for knowing may have a degree of objectivity, but the goals and objectives of science, of STEM fields, are never objective. They're value-based. They're based on paradigms. They're based on perceptions of who human beings are and what our relationship should be to one another in the environment itself, right? So it's very necessarily to culturally ground or to understand culture as we engage Black environmental history and politics. So that makes the course in and of itself interdisciplinary, right? It forces us outside of our silos and our perception of reality. So this is an important theoretical concept in the class, right? So what do we study in Black environmental history and politics? Now I'm gonna speed up a little bit through these slides. Essentially, we study everything. And that's a problem to some degree because it's constructed like an introductory class. And the goal is to inspire students to latch on to the idea that it's important for them to think about ecology. It's important for them to think about the environment. And it's important for them to think about the relationship of Black people to the environment and how they can understand their own lives outside of that context, both historical, their families, their communities, their own development, as well as long-term and midterm, the types of choices they'll make, career choices, right? Family choices, social and economic choices. You know, how will they live with this environmental consciousness? So the course is created to inspire, but it also gives a very long view of Black environmental history and politics. And one thing is that at the center of it is, can we identify if there's a shift in the historical development of Black life, particularly in the diaspora, a shift in our thinking about the environment itself, right? One thought that people in this seminar are probably familiar with is this idea that Black people haven't historically had an interest in environmental issues, right? Or an environmental consciousness. Whether that's true or not, that's always a question. And we want to understand why that question exists, if it's true, and if it has always been the case, or if it's changed and why. So we discuss a lot of things in the course, and I'm gonna highlight some of these things. One of the things we discuss is pre-colonial African culture and indigenous knowledge and perceptions around the earth and the environment. So real important. Like many indigenous people around the world, Black people had a very specific perception of the environment, right, as both spiritual and material, right? And these are just some cultural examples, right? For instance, among Akan people in present-day Ghana, West Africa, they refer to the earth as Asasaya, Earth Mother born on Thursday, right? And you see, and this knowledge is encoded in different things, right? So down here you have something called an Adinkra symbol, right? And it's cosmograms, or pictures speak 1,000 words. And these things are put into textiles and in buildings, homes and things of that nature. And it gets across the idea that the earth is mighty, all power, right? All meaning emanates from the land. Igbo people, according to Kamalu, Chukwunyere has this idea of Omenala, and he loosely, and this term Omenala has many different connotations, but one he argues in the context of Igbo culture is the idea of actions in accordance with the earth. Like there's this intertwining of Igbo culture and notions of a right relationship to the earth and the environment and all that exists in it as a living reality, and human beings being essentially a part of it. And wherever you go, in the Southern African region, in the Central African region, in the Western African region, in the Eastern African region, in parts of Northern Africa, you have this perception, although the culture may deal with it slightly differently, right? It may be called something different. It may be organized different, but this idea of human beings having a right relationship to the earth, living sustainably, is at the core of the society. And that's well, I'll come back to dogma about that, but we explore this, and we explore indigenous knowledge on multiple levels, the built environment in traditional African societies, pre-colonial, pre-enslavement. We explore food systems. We explore technology, technological development, right? To give people a sense, essentially, how did people understand and relate to the environment. It's also important for us, and we cover pre-colonial African economic systems, because that's the first space where human beings, well, I shouldn't say that the first space, that's one of the most essential spaces where human beings begin to construct knowledge around quote unquote STEM fields in relationship to the economy. So how people construct economies, their values and assumptions about it, their goals and objectives, in turn are going to inform what we could describe their approach to the natural sciences. So we reflect on the political economies of traditional African societies. For instance, Bamana have a concept that there are things you do for life in terms of work, kabolo, and then there are things you do for individual accumulation, right? And this gets across the idea in their agro-ecosystems or in their agricultural food systems, that there's some things people produce collectively because the right to food is in fact considered a right. And people do that together. And then after that's done, people can engage in production for individual wealth accumulation. But Kabolo is seen as a priority. And then we know in Africa, it's not unique to Africa, but it's definitely in Africa, this idea of the commons, that everybody should have access to food, water, and forest resources. And it's held in common, is not accumulated by individuals in elite to the extent that people are alienated from it and excluded from it, right? And this is not to say that people didn't have contradictions and problems in pre-colonial African or pre-enslavement institutions or pre-colonial society. all human beings did, but we can say there's this underlying cultural unity, what a scholar by Sheikh Anajob talks about when you look at pre-colonial African societies as it relates to how people organize themselves in relationship to the environment and how they perceive it. So we reflect on this in the class. Then we talk about slavery, as we should, but we talk about it in a different context. We talk about, and we use the term maafa, which is a Kiswahili term for great disaster, right? That's a way to look at colonialism and slavery. And we see it not just as an extension of exploitation of African labor and African bodies, but also we see it as a disarticulation of a group's culture in society in the way they constructed their relationships to the environment and society at the same time. And that's what we mean by the disarticulation of African earth-centered cultures. And how do we approach that, right? We look at things like, I call it the season of 1492. Emmanuel Wallerstein calls it the creation of the world system, right? So everything after Columbus ushers in the modern world, and how did political, economic, and environmental relationships shift as a result of the season of 1492, right? And what I like to say, the clash of three cultural forces: Europe, the US, and not the US, indigenous people in Americas and Africa. And what was the impact of this on society, economy, and the environment, right? And we use a concept like by this woman, Carolyn Merchant, wrote a book called Ecological Revolutions, right? Where she makes the argument that at certain times in history, there's this shift in consciousness because of people's change in both their perception of the environment, but also their change in their mode of production, their economy, their economic relationships, right? So an ecological revolution essentially took place during the season of 1492. And we explore in the class what that impact is on people of African descent, right? And we talk about different things like the political ecology of capitalism and industrialization. I'm not sure if folk are familiar with the enclosure movement. And this is a period in time in Europe where land that was once held in common by European peasants was then privatized. It was enclosed, right, to give birth to the industrial revolution and an emerging free market economy, capitalism, right? And what drove that was a particular worldview, that the way that the European peasantry functioned was in fact backwards scientifically. They didn't know what they were doing with the land. They were ignorant to how profitable it could be if used appropriately, right? And Ellen Meskin Wood makes the argument that this actually gives birth, this perspective actually gives birth to the scientific revolution in rationalism, right? And we reflect on this thing we call science. This is what we mean by science and technology is not objective, although it can be useful. It has to be culturally grounded in certain contexts for it to be useful. And that becomes a whole nother discussion, but we reflect on the rise of rationalism, the scientific revolution in Europe, and how that was connected to improvement philosophy and enclosure, and the rise of what some people call mechanistic thinking. We talk about the sacred cows like Descartes and Bacon and Isaac Newton because they supported improvement philosophy, particularly Newton. He was very much involved in agriculture during the period of time, as well as his work in physics and how they perceive nature. And because of how they perceive nature, how they understood and developed this notion of science. We reflect on this thing. This guy's name is Alfred Crosby, and the idea of the Columbian Exchange, where it is this exchange of plant and animal life and disease between Europe in Africa and the Americas, and its impact on a number of things, from the question of the health and well-being of people to food systems and food cultures, right? So we talk about the Columbian Exchange, and we talk about resistance to it, right? One of the I guess you could say, I like to call it fun, but examples of activity we do is, since we have many people in the class from the South and the Caribbean, we do a thing on food cultures and food systems where students have to choose a dish from some place in the African diaspora that's a product of the Columbian Exchange, and they have to cook it from scratch. They can't purchase it. And then they have to come in and talk about its food history, its ingredients, and the social context in which it is consumed. And they're having that discussion while we're eating together, the particular dish that they prepare. And that's always pretty fun, but it talks about forms of Black resistance, right? Many of the plant species that we find in Africa, find in the New World, the quote unquote New World, have come from Africa. US agriculture itself was built not on the back, but on knowledge of Black people that Black people brought from Africa about agroecosystems, right? We talk about land reform, and I'm just pointing out different things. If people are familiar with the whole conversation around reparations, you often hear this thing, 40 acres and a mule. That comes from a period of time in the Civil War where General Sherman actually ceded land from Charleston, South Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida, 30 miles inland to Black people after a conversation with Black elders and leaders in Savannah, Georgia, right? So we have conversations around the political economy of land and land reform and its importance, not just in the context of the US, but in the context of other parts of the world as well. We talk about the Industrial Revolution, right? And its impact on the environment, right? And the rise of the dependence on non-renewable resources such as coal and oil and centralized factories, and the beginning of a mass consumer-based society in the US and how that spread to other parts of the world, right? The evolution of fossil fuel use in the modern era, and how that's connected to something called an urban bias, right? Our preoccupation with notions of development that associate urbanization, high levels of technological development, mass consumerism with advanced societies. So then indigenous people, Black folk in particular, folks from the global South, are perceived as less than and undeveloped when compared to Western Europe and its technological development and expansive industrial economies. We reflect on stuff like that, but we link that to things like the colonization of Africa. So you can't talk about the industrialization of Europe without the colonization of Africa. It's impossible, because the material basis for industrialization comes from the exploitation of the colonies and the exploitation of people and the environment in the southern US as well. So we link industrialization to sharecropping and lynching and Jim Crow and political disenfranchisement. This is kind of given the long history, and then Black response, the evolution of HBCUs and approaches to STEM within the context of historically Black colleges and universities, right? We reflect on the industrialization of agriculture and its impact on the environment, and conventional ag's impact in particular, the green revolution, the rise of the chemical industry. So all these things become, and I'm going through this quickly on important just to give you a taste. We reflect on Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the rise of the petrochemical industry, its impact on the environment, and we connect that to both the green industrial revolution, changes in the climate since the industrial revolution, right? We reflect on these issues. The first half of the class is actually dedicated towards kind of an environmental history, and then we kind of bleed into contemporary issues like Black land loss, gentrification, and sprawl, right? Which are really important because we're posing the question, how did the ecological revolution impact African descended communities? The phenomenon of environmental racism, right? We know in communities of color have the highest exposure rates to air pollution, lead poisoning, climate change disproportionately impacts. All of this stuff I'm sure people in this talk are very familiar with, right? We talk about development and ecological debt, that all people don't consume, right? And create waste at the same levels, that there's this link. If you talk about the financial debt, right? That Africa and the global South and the Caribbean seem to be in debt. But if you talk about the ecological debt, it's a reverse. And this is when we get into concepts like carrying capacity, ecological footprints, to make sense of this ecological debt question and overshoot, right? You're probably familiar with this. We reflect on Hurricane, well, I shouldn't say we reflect on Hurricane Katrina. In the past, in the second half of the class, students are responsible for actually making an analysis of contemporary issues. Some of them could be related to climate change, the food system, environmental racism, land issues, and these are some of the issues students will cover in what we call Indaba presentations. And so like, for instance, Hurricane Katrina, Black fishermen in the Gulf oil crisis were some issues we dealt with. Climate gentrification in Miami, people familiar with because of sea level rise and coastal property and people who are wealthy and most often white move into higher ground to inner areas of Miami where you have people of color, in particular, Little Haiti, and it being gentrified, not just because of socioeconomic issues, but ecological shifts as a result of climate disruption. The Flint water crisis, for instance.
May I make a comment on that, Dr. Densu?
Go ahead.
Yeah, when you're talking about gentrification, my family, they're from Tennessee, and the area they live in is similar to what you were saying. And there are a lot of these new houses. It sticks out because it's not like the other houses. It's very like urban, and you can tell that it's, you know, gentrification is happening in that area.
Right. And it's in both socioeconomic phenomenon, but it's also an ecological phenomenon, right? And that becomes important to consider. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier. Like, these are two sides of the same coin. And I'm gonna just click through these so we can go ahead and have a discussion. We just don't concentrate on Black people in the US. So we talk about oil in Nigeria, deforestation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, e-waste in Ghana, food system issues, food deserts, Black response, environmental justice movements, right? The rise of Black food security networks. This is the example of the Detroit Black Food Security Network in Detroit. That's a person by the name of Malik Yakini. Students actually will do research on that. We talk about Haiti, right, in response to deforestation, the earthquakes, right, political instability, the rise of the Papaya peasant movement, right, land struggles in Brazil, issues that we deal with, response to Greenbelt movement. Everybody's probably familiar with Wangari Maathai in Kenya. And this is interesting because these are actually FAMU grads. Kashawn Myers graduated from the psychology department, but also Brandon Rogers. They're actually in Ghana as we speak, and they're developing a sustainability center named after a botanist from Ghana named Kweku Ando, you know, where they're envisioning alternative forms of the built environment based on sustainable food production, sustainable energy, sustainable building. or sustainable ways to engage in the built environment, housing, things of that nature. And this is an example. And these are actually family grads. So we look at solutions as well. And then I have something, if people are interested in last year would have been our 5th year, and a number of students in the School of the Environment have gone before. We actually have a study abroad program in the same vein as this Black environmental history and politics. And it's in Cuba, where we spend like a 10-day educational tour studying sustainability and environmental issues and their intersection with the history, the culture, the contemporary social and economic problems of people of African descent in Cuba, right? And it's very interesting. It's been very productive, and a number of students, and it's interdisciplinary. So students have gone from the School of Environment to the College of Social Sciences, Arts and Humanities, CAFS, School of Architecture, journalism, graduate students, undergraduate students. Real important experience studying Black environmental history and politics. And we also, FAMU, through that program, developed a memorandum of understanding with Antonio Nunez Jimenez Foundation for Nature Humanity, right, which is their premier NGO around issues of the environment in Cuba. And we collaborate with FANJ. We go to FANJ, and then this is a picture of their educational coordinator, Roberto, who has actually been, Roberto Perez, been to FAMU speaking on climate change, sustainable development from a Cuban perspective, right? So this is essentially an approach to teaching Black environmental history and politics, and kind of making that, because the goal is to make that a part of the culture of historically Black colleges and universities in the general sense, Florida A&M University in particular. And we see the school, or I always see the School of the Environment as central to that project. Now, in there.
All right, thank you, Dr. Densu. There was a question from Dr. Ziewitz. Is there any book in particular that covers the indigenous African traditions about the earth?
There are many different books, pieces, right? Person, divinity, and nature, and not just traditional ways of knowing and relating to the earth, but I think you may have seen, well, let me not go back. Judith Carney, let me see how far I can go back to. These are some interesting texts, if you will. I've gone too far back. I'm sorry. But yes, there are many different texts. If people are interested in that, I can actually provide a list, or like a bibliography, right? Black Rice, Person, Divinity, and Nature by Chukwuemeka Kamalu. I wrote an article on African-centered eco-philosophy and praxis, and the title is Omenala, In the Shadow of Slavery. These are books by Judith Carney who are good, right? There are many ways to kind of approach the study of that. There's a whole field initiated by an anthropologist called Dennis Warren. It's not unique to Africa, but this idea of developing centers of indigenous knowledge, right, around the world, in different parts of the world, and developing research out of that. He's written a few pieces as well.
Okay, and I've had several people ask if about the recordings. So Dr. Densu, if you have a PDF version of this, and this was a great presentation, if you have a PDF version you would like for me to distribute to everyone, I'll touch base with you after the presentation.
Definitely.
And then I'll send it out to everyone. Is there any other questions? I'll check the chat one more because I got a lot of comments here.
Wait, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. I don't have a question. I have a comment. Dr. Densu, this is Miss Jefferson Yeager. That presentation was amazing and excellent. I truly enjoyed it. It was incredibly informative. And like you said, you only gave us a taste, and it has definitely left me seeking more information about these different topics that you brought up. So thank you so much.
Appreciate you. I appreciate you. And I hope I didn't go too fast, but that's much appreciated.
If I could chime in as well to thank you so much for just the breadth and scope and grounding that you're offering as we, it doesn't just to expand the perspective really throughout the history of human civilization. Really, you've somehow managed to pull that all together, and it sounds just amazing. So thank you so much.
Much appreciated, Catherine. It was good seeing you too.
Same here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, one question just came in. How do we improve our carbon footprint, support African and African-American initiatives on food sustainability? And that's from Nico Slater.
So you should, so I would say always support local growers, right? Grow your own food, improve both your carbon footprint and what I like the food sovereignty in Black communities, but in a general sense, people should be more and more comfortable with growing food in the spaces that they supporting production of local food in a sustainable fashion, supporting Black farmers. I know there have been several attempts through the Sustainability Institute was the last one to develop space on FAMU's campus for students to get involved in the production of food and the appreciation for the production of local food. So those are very simple things that can be done in our busy lives. Put the cell phones down, put the social media, and put our hands in the soil.
May I ask a question?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay. Now this approach, I heard you reference in the beginning of your presentation how you introduce this to your students. How would you go about introducing this topic to high school students? Like getting them engaged? Is there certain activities or literature that you would recommend? But how do we go about, I guess, involving or stimulating young students or high school to immerse themselves in African American environmental science?
So my emphasis on the STEM fields has been historically through food, because that's what I do. So like, for instance, we tried to do this at Bond Elementary, right? We, at the time that the principal there was Brandy McIntosh, and we created a garden and attempted to build a food forest on the school grounds. And that became, for lack of a better term, a laboratory to engage students around Black environmental history, food systems, the environment, things of that nature. So that's one thing that I actually participated in. I went to, and then see, that's interesting. I went to an agricultural high school. But when I went, I wanted to be a veterinarian. So half of the day was spent in academic classrooms. And then the other half of the day, we were on the farm, in the forest, so training horses, herding cattle, like dealing with small animals, whether they were dogs or lab rats and hamsters. Like all our stuff was, we milked all of this stuff was hand-on. So this, particularly with young people, and especially, and we probably all experiencing this, those here who are parents, the challenges with schooling under COVID, it's like it reinforces the idea that people have to move outside of the desk, outside of the classroom, and into the environment itself. And that's one of the main ways to inspire young people. But it also has to be culturally grounded and connected to who they are historically and in terms of their identity, right? So one thing we found, for instance, as young as elementary school, that over at Bond, is that when you talked about, let's say gardening, they immediately associated it with slavery. Just immediately. I don't know if they were taught that, or I doubt if they read it, but their orientation around being in the environment and engaging in food production, just in a garden context, was associated with slavery. So we had to address that directly through conversations, through storytelling, through the arts, right? Through song, to culturally address issues that Black children in particular deal with around the environment. So there are multiple ways to actually do that. Very few texts that I know that address that directly, but there are definitely programs around the country that try to deal with these questions.
So I have a question. It sounds as if the approach that you're suggesting is going with more of a place-based learning or community science approach and dealing directly with these issues. How do you implement that without effectively removing students or young kids from the traditional structure that's in place right now?
When you say traditional structure, you mean educational institutions?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's what I'm talking about.
Well, I mean, so this is going back to, if we want to transform the environment, we got to transform social and economic institutions. They're two sides of the same coin. So schools have to change if we want climate change to change. That sounds silly, but if we want to stop climate disruption, it has to be in the schools. And however it needs to be taught, it needs to be taught. If that disrupts pre-existing structures, then we have to build new structures. So we can't have change in response to the environment without changing the social and economic conditions that gave birth to it. And one of the things that gave birth to it is this is what I like to call the urban bias. It's the removal of people from the environment itself, which school teaches. We're indoctrinated that in the context, the way STEM is done is essentially away from, if we use the metaphor of the laboratory for mechanistic science itself, you know, and not to say that those approaches to knowledge production don't have some value, right? Or a lecture, if we dealt with in the context of school or sitting down at a desk, isn't a valuable strategy sometimes, but clearly is problematic, not just in terms of our understanding of the environment, but our physical health in a general sense, right? So there are multiple ways to look at that, you know, the destruction of, or the absence of recess, and the absence of people's interaction with the environment, and the rise of social media technology and the use of social media in the context of the school. All that for me is connected to our alienation from the environment and our inability to see and change issues related to both local phenomena of environmental disruption and climate disruption at the global level. So schools have to change. And this is what I hope for FAMU. Essentially, and teaching this class is just one small step, real tiny, 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 tiny step to give historical context to what we're looking at and inspire students, Black students in particular, to think about this stuff in a general sense.
Dr. Densu, I was wondering if I could connect this with something you said. I think, you know, I've confronted this issue of the historical legacy of slavery with agriculture. And it seems that if we are taking a new approach, I'd like to think in terms of a regenerative paradigm, even beyond sustainability. It's like sustainability, we're not doing it. We have to be more radical and deliberately try to regenerate. And as you know, the very thesis of your talk is the connection of culture and the earth. What we do to people and what we do to the land are intertwined. So I'm just wondering, I think that the emphasis upon indigenous culture and going back to what happened before these terribly disruptive events in history mess things up for people could not be a major pathway for healing, for restoration of culture, to go back to those original things and say, look, yes, you know, this, what happened during slavery, the land was raped along with the people. And let's go back and look before that happened and learn about it and learn those traditions. And is that an avenue that you have any guidance for us who are trying to regenerate?
No, I mean, that's exactly true. There's a traditional Akan concept called Sankofa, and it's a bird looking backwards, but the whole metaphor is around this idea of looking back to move forward. And that's not to suggest that indigenous cultures were static in terms of their evolution and development. It's to say that their development was disrupted, and there's certain things that are important lessons for how human beings should relate to one another in the environment that should have been carried forward. And that, you know, so this is why that concept that Carolyn Merchant points out, ecological revolution, this shift in a consciousness about our relationship to Earth, the relationship between society, economy, and technology. What is that shift? And then how do we re-envision that in this historical moment by looking back? Right. So Akila Sherrill, and this is interesting, he was an activist he is an activist in LA around gang violence, but he became involved in the environmental movement. And his argument was the destruction of the environment, sprawl, food deserts, all of that, the wildfires in LA, that there's a direct parallel to that, an emergence of gang violence. And he didn't use the term regenerative. He talked about the emergence of what he called the reverence movement. This was about 10, 15 years ago. So having reverence for human life and reverence for nature, you know, and he said, you know, his argument was the opioid crisis, but at that time it wasn't opioids, but suicide that we would typically associate with middle-class white youth. He was like, it's a different problem, but its underlying issue is the same as gang violence in the context of LA. This problem with relationships and how we perceive them, right? It's still, some people have more power socioeconomically and their life chances may be different, but this underlying cultural conflict impacts everybody. So the idea of acting locally in a geographic and cultural context, in a community context, you know, local communities, local ethnicities, local geographies, that's same as community, but people thinking globally in solidarity with one another, regenerative, reverence. We got a lot of names for it. My concern a lot of times is the praxis. You know, concepts become important, but especially in the academy, we can flip concepts for a lot of different reasons, tenure in particular. But the point is, the praxis is key. And many different indigenous communities have said the same thing in their own language. You know, so we should be about reframing and revitalizing that in this moment.
Okay. Dr. Densu, thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. Awesome presentation. We can keep on the line for those of you who may have any questions, but I know it's after 12:15 and many of you may have to move on to the next, whether classes or whatever you got going on. But if you're open to staying a little bit and answer some more questions, I'm open to leaving the line open. But is there any other questions at this time? All right. Well, again, Dr. Densu,
Okay.
can't thank you enough. Can't thank you enough. It was great.
No problem.
I'll be in touch with you shortly. And then everyone, please be on the lookout for the follow-up email and survey as well. If you can participate in that, your feedback is greatly appreciated. Thanks again, everyone. Enjoy your weekend. Stay safe.
Definitely. Take care.
Thank you, Dr. Densu.
Great.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.